This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 749 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. I've been doing a whole lot of prospect talk over the last month and a half. It's nice to change things up a bit. As most of you know, the free agency period started in the NFL, and a lot has gone down across the league. I've talked about some of those moves on the mailbag episodes, but as I do each year, this episode right here breaks down all of those free agency moves, or at least a lot of the major ones. And I'll talk about some of the trades that have gone down too. So on today's episode, I'm going to give some fantasy football takes on what's gone down in free agency. But before digging in, I want to remind you all to check out the Late Round Prospect Guide. It's 135 pages of detailed numbers-driven analysis about this year's running back and wide receiver draft classes. But then on top of that, I got an entire section in that guide dedicated to my year 2 model, which is a model that helps project how well second-year players are going to do in year 2 and in year 3. So it'll help you know what to do with guys like Isaiah Pacheco, Dameon Pierce, Sky Moore, what you should do with those guys in Dynasty. You can check all of that out right now by heading to lateround.com and purchasing the guide for just $14.99. One of the big moves of this free agency period wasn't even a signing. It was a trade. And it was the trade that the Bears did with the Panthers to get out of the first overall pick. With that deal, DJ Moore became a Chicago Bear. Even though I believe the Bears are going to be more pass-heavy this year, I don't think we're looking at a situation where the offense does what the Eagles' offense did in 2022, which was support multiple high-end pass catchers in fantasy football. Chicago had by far the lowest pass rate in the league last year, and it was the lowest that we've seen since at least 2011. That's just as far back as I go. Philadelphia was well above that in 2021 before they took their step forward. But a team like Philly took a step forward not because their passing volume saw this serious spike. They increased their pass attempts per game by just 2.5 year over year. It's about efficiency. Can Justin Fields be more efficient in 2023? I mean, he better be. The team invested in weapons. That excuse is gone. But in 2022, Justin Fields was dead last in passing expected points per dropback according to Number Fire's expected points model. That's among 300 plus attempt passers. And it really wasn't even close. That was partially because of his arm, but it was also partially because he takes a lot of sacks. He had a minus 0.17 passing expected points per dropback. The year prior, Jalen Hurts was 19th out of 30 qualified quarterbacks within that statistic. So he was better than Fields, and his per dropback efficiency was significantly better at positive 0.09. I think you can get into a lot of trouble by just assuming giant leaps at the quarterback position. Yes, added weapons helped Josh Allen. It helped Jalen Hurts. And it'll help Justin Fields too. But it's important to look at this from a probability standpoint rather than factually. So you've got an efficiency problem for DJ Moore on top of a volume one. Even if the Bears see the biggest increase in pass attempts per game year over year that we've seen from a team since 2011, they'll still be a run-heavy team. They'll still rank in the bottom 5, at least the bottom 10, in pass attempts. I love DJ Moore, the player. He's seen prorated target shares of 28% over his last 2 seasons. But not only is that going to be hard to come by, but even if he does see that type of target share in Chicago, that doesn't even guarantee him 130 targets in this offense. A lot needs to go right for DJ Moore to be a wide receiver 1 in fantasy football. Maybe he can hit wide receiver 2 territory with a huge jump from Fields. But I would not be surprised at all, and keep in mind, this is me speaking before actually making projections for the season, but I would not be surprised if he was more of a wide receiver 3 in fantasy football this year. And since this deal went down, he's being drafted more as a low-end wide receiver 2. Now, speaking of the Bears, David Montgomery is no longer in Chicago. I'll get to that new backfield in a second, but let's talk about Montgomery first. Montgomery's going to fill the Jamal Williams role in Detroit. It's a role that was pretty awesome for fantasy last year. Williams finished as an RB2 in PPR points per game. He averaged 13.3 points per contest. As we also know, he scored a whole lot of touchdowns. Williams finished the year with 17 rushing touchdowns. That number's been hit just 5 other times since 2011. The wild part about his season was that of the other guys who have gotten there, Williams had by far the worst peripherals. He finished last season with a running back rush share per game of 61%. He saw 2.9% of the team's targets. It was very much like LeGarrette Blount's 2016 season with New England. That year, Blount scored 18 times on the ground. He carried 74% of New England's running back rushes, and he had a 1.5% target share in that offense. LeGarrette Blount had 29 goal line attempts that season. That was tied for the third most since 2011. You know who had the most? Jamal Williams. He had 33. I'm here to be objective. And objectively, numbers like that do not repeat. Not from the same player and not from the same role. Blount had 29 goal line attempts in 2016. Like I said, he scored 18 touchdowns. That next season, all New England running backs combined for 16 rushing touchdowns on 23 goal line attempts. So even if one running back saw 100% of those numbers, it still wouldn't have surpassed LeGarrette Blount's 2016. We've seen 25 seasons since 2011 where a running back had 20 or more goal line rushes. Remember, Jamal Williams was at 33, significantly higher than 20. Those 25 seasons were made up of 22 unique players, which means 3 players did it twice, those 3 being Michael Turner, Dalvin Cook, and Todd Gurley. And the reason that only 3 players have done that twice, the reason that only 3 players have seen multiple seasons of 20-plus goal line attempts is because it's very hard to get that many goal line attempts. It's not common. David Montgomery is going to play that role, yes. He's probably going to score a lot of touchdowns. But to anyone thinking he's going to score Jamal Williams-level touchdowns, I think that's a very bad bet based on history. What could be an okay bet is Montgomery seeing more work through the air than what Williams did. Maybe that happens. And if you're a believer in that happening, then it can combat that touchdown regression a bit. But don't forget about DeAndre Swift. I know, he's burned you. The fantasy community overrates DeAndre Swift. I know, I've heard it, I've seen the takes about Swift. And the Montgomery signing was definitely not good for him at all. But I think it's a mistake to assume that last season is the norm for DeAndre Swift. He was banged up throughout the year, which is a totally separate issue. And he ended the season with a 28% running back rush share per game. His first year in the league, that number was 45%. In year 2, it was 50%. Last year, it was 28%. All the while, his per game target share was still 15%. He's seen a 13%, 17.5%, and 15% target share per game rate over his 3 years in the league. Those are very good numbers. I just don't think it's rational to think that DeAndre Swift's running back rush share is going to continue to be so low. I mean, among all running backs with 8 or more games played last year, Swift was 50th in running back rush share per game. 50th. You mean to tell me that there are that many running backs who are better rushers than DeAndre Swift? Or that deserve more work within their offense? He may not rank in the top 10 or the top 20, but I mean, the dude had a lower share of his team's running back rushes than James Cook and Kenyon Drake and A.J. Dillon last season. The list goes on and on. Maybe that means I'll be higher on Swift and lower on Montgomery. I don't think that's necessarily going to be the case, but maybe that is the case. I just think that kind of context is very important. To me, we should not be projecting based on Swift's 2022 season. And that could limit Montgomery more than expected, even with that decent deal that he got. But also keep in mind that both players can thrive in this offense and be fine. Maybe not dual RB1s, but very fine and usable. We're living in a fantasy football world with tons of running back by committees. And the Lions should be strong offensively. And they should give their backfield plenty of opportunities. After all, they were first in the league in team fantasy points scored at that position last year. Now, with David Montgomery out of Chicago, that Bears backfield looked like it was going to be Khalil Herbert's. They signed Travis Homer, they have Treston Ebner, and then there's Herbert, who's been a really, really good runner over his first 2 years in the league. And then they signed D'Onta Foreman to a 1-year, $3 million deal. My issue with this signing, aside from making this backfield even more crowded, is that it's a redundant piece to Khalil Herbert. It actually signals to me that while the Bears are doing what they can to surround Justin Fields with more talent, they still want to have a ground and pound mentality. That's their identity. D'Onta Foreman is a bruiser. He ranked 14th last season in yards after contact per attempt, according to PFF. He's over 230 pounds. He was that type of runner as a prospect, too. Khalil Herbert was 4th last year in yards after contact per attempt. No one can question if they have players who can break tackles. The problem is neither player has been much of a pass catcher throughout their career. Herbert's been above a 15% target share in just one career game. Foreman's been that high 0 times. Foreman's actually never gotten past a 10% target share. Not that there's a ton of value in the pass catching back in an offense like this, but it would definitely give the early down back more of a ceiling. And now that there are redundant pieces back there, we're probably looking at a situation where neither guy is super fantasy relevant without an injury. So it made sense for real football, this D'Onta Foreman signing, but it may hurt in fake football. I talked about Derek Carr a couple of mailbag episodes ago, so I'll leave that take there. But Carr got a new weapon out of the backfield in Jamal Williams, someone I was talking about earlier. I think this signing is pretty straightforward. Alvin Kamara has historically had some sort of 1B in his backfield throughout his career. But over the last 2 seasons, he's seen his 2 highest running back rush shares. Last year on a per-game basis, he was handling over 76% of the Saints' running back rushes. The year before that, almost 77%. During his 4 years before all that, his average was 50%. The Saints didn't really have a backup plan. And they not only need one as Kamara ages, but Kamara could be suspended this year too. So Williams steps in and he can serve as a change of pace bruiser type, all while seeing a lot of work if Kamara's sidelined for any reason, whether that be injury or suspension. What that means for fantasy is that Williams is probably a better best ball type player. I hate to use that as an excuse. I hate to use that in my analysis, but it's true. And he's in that flex with upside territory, given we know that he's a solid running back. The only quarterback move that I want to talk about on today's show is with Jimmy Garoppolo. I could talk about Baker Mayfield too, but I think we understand that situation a little bit more. And that Baker isn't any sort of long-term solution unless things really, really click. Jimmy Garoppolo is a very strange evaluation for me. He himself isn't going to be anything more than a streamer in fantasy football, more than likely. I mean, in San Francisco, with better weapons, with a better offensive situation, he wasn't more than a streamer. We shouldn't expect more in Vegas. It's also unclear if he's someone who can elevate the guys around him. We know the Kyle Shanahan offense is centered around getting the ball in his playmakers' hands and allowing them to generate yards after the catch. That's what that whole offense is about. Jimmy G had some unbelievably low deep ball rates as a 49er. He wasn't above 15% on 15-plus air yard throw rate in any of his last 4 seasons. The average across the league last year was closer to 17%. Garoppolo hasn't come close to that over his last 4. Maybe that's why the Raiders went out and got Jacoby Myers, because they didn't care to have someone who was going to stretch the field, since the offense would become more horizontal in nature. They did sign Philip Dorsett, another former Patriot, but unless Hunter Renfrow and Jacoby Myers are sidelined on 3 wide sets, Dorsett's not going to see the field that much. Now, Myers doesn't play exclusively the slot, but he's definitely a slot receiver. He's played 60 to 70% of his snaps from that area of the field in each of his last 3 seasons. When we call someone a slot player, it doesn't mean that they're Cole Beasley. It just means that they're usually glued to that part of the field. With Hunter Renfrow in the mix in Vegas, though, I would imagine that we see Myers more on the outside. And I'm not sure that's the biggest deal in the world either, depending on your expectation. According to PFF, Myers scored half of his touchdowns last year from the slot, and he saw about 55% of his targets from that area of the field, but he ran almost 70% of his routes from there. So he actually didn't perform horribly outside that area of the field. Now, Mac Hollins played this perimeter role last year for the Raiders. He saw almost a 17% target share per game rate, which is not that bad. And Myers is a better player than Mac Hollins. And Darren Waller's now out. So I think that Jacoby Myers could approach a 20% target share in this offense. And this also leads me to believe that they're going to use Devontae Adams just like they did last season. I don't think people realize how vertical Adams' role was in 2022. Mac Hollins had the highest average depth of target on that team among the trio of wide receivers who saw the most targets, but it was only by a yard. Adams had the highest ADOT of his career last year, and he saw a 15-plus air yard target on almost 30% of his targets. That was the second highest rate of his career. And the thing is, Jimmy G may not have pushed it down the field that often in San Francisco, but he was really accurate on 15-plus air yard throws in 2 of his 3 seasons there, where he saw a lot of volume. He did fall a bit this past year, but I think Garoppolo can sustain what Derek Carr was doing, essentially. So to me, I think we're going to see Jakobi Meyers play more on the outside, and I would expect mostly the same from Davante Adams. Maybe we see a dip in target share because the rapport isn't there, at least not yet, but Garoppolo can hit those intermediate and deeper throws just as well as Derek Carr can. That's what the numbers say, at least. And I would expect more 11 personnel from the Raiders now that Darren Waller's out. More 3-wide sets. And that could actually really help Hunter Renfrow, who often played behind Matt Collins last year. So if they want to get their best playmakers out there, they're going to have to run more 11 personnel. So all of this is to say that things seem pretty neutral for the Raiders, in my opinion. Maybe there's a slight downgrade because Garoppolo's only done serious work in an easier system, but it definitely could be worse. Let's go from the Raiders to an ex-Raider and Darren Waller. Waller was traded to the Giants, and it's a team that really didn't use their tight ends that much last year. Only the Bills and the Dolphins had lower tight end team target shares. But I say this all the time, personnel can often drive those numbers. Waller immediately becomes a top option in that offense, and he should command a high target share as long as he's healthy. This is where you can often find edges in fantasy football, because a lot of people are going to automatically assume that this offense just doesn't run through tight ends, that tight ends just don't matter. But it's important to layer personnel on top of that. Even if you want to look at what Dable did in Buffalo, sure, they didn't use tight ends that much, but they also didn't have a Darren Waller type tight end. Again, that's assuming that he's healthy, which has not been a given the last 2 years with only 20 games played. But Daniel Jones targeted the slot a lot last year because the Giants lacked a perimeter presence. To me, that tells us that he'll be looking to throw to his best players. The Giants were 25th in raw pass attempts last year, but they were 18th in overall targets to the slot. My stance overall is that if Waller is healthy, he should be competing for mid tight end 1 territory. I think the days of him being a dominant tight end 1 in fantasy football are probably done. But the Giants are trending up, and if they increase their pass volume, which may naturally happen this year, Waller could see a lot of looks in that offense that lacks alternatives. Now I'll just group JuJu Smith-Schuster and Mike Gesicki together and talk about this new look Patriots offense. Straight up, JuJu looks like he's going to replace Jakobi Meyers. You know, last year we actually saw the Chiefs move JuJu around quite a bit. According to PFF, Smith-Schuster ran 43% of his routes from the slot. That was a career low. And he ended up seeing a 17% target share in that offense per game, which was also a low since his rookie season. I don't think that's a coincidence. I mean, JuJu Smith-Schuster is a slot receiver. And given Jakobi Meyers was getting close to that 70% mark in the slot, I would imagine that JuJu sees an uptick there. That he's going to play more in the slot this year than he did last year. And that should increase his target share in that offense. And even though this offense is going to score far, far fewer touchdowns than what Smith-Schuster saw with Kansas City last year, he still only scored 3 times in 2022. He had 1 touchdown on 16 red zone targets. Based on where he was seeing his looks last year, he should have been closer to 5 touchdowns. For PPR purposes, I don't think this is that bad of a spot for JuJu. At least to be like a wide receiver 3. Were there better landing spots? Of course. But he could see a high target share in this particular offense. He basically could replicate what Jakobi Meyers did last year. And then Mike Gesicki could have had a worse landing spot too, I guess. It could have been better for sure. There are some teams out there that really need a tight end, but it could have been worse. I know JuJu Smith had a pretty underwhelming time in New England with 9 to 10% target shares in that offense, but Gesicki is a better natural pass catcher and receiver than JuJu Smith is. So maybe he can get into that 13 to 15% target share range. And maybe Bill O'Brien goes tight end heavy like we've seen at times in the past. But it's still an offense that's probably not going to run a ton of plays, and it's not going to be super pass heavy. Basically, I would be surprised if either of these guys dominates in fantasy football next year. Tight end is bad enough to where Gesicki could end up being a usable piece, and JuJu might have an okay floor. But I would not bet on these guys being league-winning players. The Carolina Panthers really didn't have that much going for them at the skill positions entering free agency. And they still kind of don't. At the time of this recording, there are rumors that they're going to get DJ Chark, but they also signed Miles Sanders, Adam Thielen, and Hayden Hurst. Chances are a rookie quarterback is going to play the vast majority of their quarterback snaps this season. And that's generally a bad thing for all positions in an offense. I talked about that all the way back on episode 518. I think at this moment, Adam Thielen is the best bet to lead that team in targets. But we have to be realistic about the kind of player that Adam Thielen is. He's seen his yards per route run rate drop in 3 consecutive seasons. And it was 1.06 this past year. That's really not good at all. Among all 100 plus target wide receivers since 2011, that yards per route run rate, 5th worst. Right now, I would honestly rather just throw darts at Terrace Marshall. Not that I think he's going to revive things and become this stud, but there's probably more upside given that he's entering year 3. He's on the right side of his age curve. Now, I don't think that Hayden Hurst is someone to get super detailed about here, so let's just move to Miles Sanders. It's a good landing spot considering there's nothing else in that Carolina backfield right now. But Deuce Staley is the Carolina Panthers assistant coach and running backs coach. And that's not good news. We saw the split backfield in Detroit, which is where Deuce Staley was. We saw him not give Miles Sanders a bell cow workload in Philadelphia. And there's a tweet from the Athletics' Joe Person, who covers the Panthers for them. There's a tweet that says that Deuce Staley believes in using 3 running backs because the position is like being in a, quote, car wreck. I would highly, highly doubt that the Panthers enter the season with this running back room. And this is a deep running back class. So I would imagine that they try to add a running back. Maybe with a 3rd rounder that they have, or one of their 4th rounders. Sanders has never been a back who commands a high target share either. So I'm not super bullish on his fantasy outlook. He may end up getting by with volume, but it's not like the Panthers offense is going to be shredding defenses next year, more than likely. Rashad Penny signed with the Eagles, and when it happened, everyone on fantasy Twitter was understandably excited. Penny's been insanely banged up throughout his NFL career, but he's absolutely shown flashes. We all remember his stretch at the end of the 2021 season where he won some fantasy leagues for people, and even last year he was effective on the ground. Over the last 2 years, he's outproduced his running back teammates in yards per carry by 1.5 yards and 2.0 yards. Among all the 50-plus attempt rushers over these last 2 seasons, those are both top 5 numbers. He has 2 of the top 5 seasons within that stat. The biggest issue with Penny in Seattle was that he was never seeing looks through the air. He had a sub 4% target share per game rate in every season there. But Philadelphia is the right spot for that to not matter. The Eagles were dead last in running back target share last year. Miles Sanders still got by behind a good offensive line and a lot of scoring opportunities. You could argue that a healthy Rashad Penny could be even more effective than Miles Sanders on the ground. Just don't sleep on the Eagles continuing to add pieces to that backfield. Kenneth Gainwell can steal some pass catching work, but Penny didn't sign for a whole lot of money at all. Philly could very easily add another piece during the draft. I just wouldn't expect it to be an early round one. Penny does have potential to replicate what Miles Sanders did last year. Just be aware that Sanders did outperform in the touchdown column by a couple of scores. Now let's finish today's show by talking about the Cowboys. They did a few interesting things over the last couple of weeks, including keeping Tony Pollard around, getting rid of Ezekiel Elliott, and trading for Brandon Cooks. Pollard was someone who helped the hashtag brand a whole lot last year. I think he's an awesome player, clearly. And I don't think I really need to talk about his upside without Zeke, because we saw it last year. It's an RB1 in fantasy football, even a top 6 running back. But it's very clear that the Cowboys are going to do something more at running back. They're probably going to draft a running back. It's just Pollard and Malik Davis right now. And that's a problem. I don't think they'll be the ones who land Bijan Robinson, but we've seen them do irrational things with running back selections in the past. I do think that there's a chance that a better than expected running back lands there. And that may move Pollard's value downward in the market. We now have years of data showing us that the Cowboys don't view Tony Pollard as a true bell cow back. He's just so good that he can still be fantasy relevant. But he had a 44% running back rush share per game rate last year to go along with a 10.6% target share per game rate. Those are good numbers, but they're nothing to write home about. I could absolutely see them adding one of the bigger bodied backs in this draft. Whether it's a guy like Kendre Miller, maybe Izzy Abanikanda, or Roschon Johnson. So as much as I love Pollard, as much as I want to see all the volume go to him, the depth chart tells us that there's more to come. Ezekiel Elliott as competition for Tony Pollard might have honestly been better than whatever they end up doing. And I love the Brandon Cooks move. I saw a lot of tweets saying that he was toast, but I don't really agree with that. He had a 1.64 yards per route run rate last year, which isn't great, but it's fine. And that was on a team with really bad quarterback play. Cooks' yards per route run was actually a half a yard better than his wide receiver teammates. It was almost identical to Nico Collins. And that was all while having issues with the team. I think it's a move the Cowboys desperately needed to make in order to get a vertical threat in that offense. And he's still just 29 years old. It seems like Brandon Cooks should be 35, but he'll be 30 in September. So Pollard is going to get competition, and Cooks is the right fit for this offense. So Dak gets a boost, it should open things up for CeeDee Lamb, and Michael Gallup gets knocked down. And Nico Collins is a little bit more interesting now too. That's the fantasy football impact of those moves. Now, I know there are other things that happen in free agency, and obviously when players leave teams, there's a domino effect. So if you have any more questions about this stuff, feel free to ask them for future mailbag episodes. I'll gladly answer. Or join the Late Round Fantasy Football Patreon, where I'm going to be having more Q&A sessions now that things are starting to pick up again. But that's it for today's show. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Before I let you go, we've got another donation. Scott has decided to donate 5 guides, and as he told me, he doesn't want his arch nemesis to get it. So go to lateround.com, and when you purchase this year's prospect guide, use promo code ANYONEBUTKEEGAN, and you'll get a free guide if you're one of the first 5 people to do that. Again, there are only 5 uses of that code. So when you're purchasing the guide and using that code, you'll know that it worked if you're purchasing for $0. If it's not $0, it means the 5 uses of that discount code have already been used up. And again, the discount code is ANYONEBUTKEEGAN. And please only use the code if you know that you're going to be unable to pay for the guide this year. This is really the community at work trying to pay it forward, and it's greatly, greatly appreciated. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you later in the week.